Today on Better Book Clubs, tips for reading Kate Chopin's classic novel, The Awakening. I actually wrote my master's degree thesis on Kate Chopin's The Awakening, so this is a novel that I used to at least know more about than any other novel ever published. It's not necessarily my favorite novel, but it's an absolute classic for anyone who's interested in feminist literature. So many books of the 19th century were written by men about women. And Kate Chopin is a real standout as an author who is a woman writing about a woman's experience. And she did so in a way that was absolutely scandalous at the time of the publication of this novel in 1899. So here's Kate Chopin judging a woman character on her own terms. So even though the main character in The Awakening, Edna Pontellier, is doing something that many women characters in other novels by men were doing, that is committing adultery, she's doing so on the terms that her female author has set up for her. It's absolutely a radical reading for that reason. Edna is also a more sympathetic character as a result than a character like, say, Flaubert's Madame Bovary. So The Awakening was published, as I said, in 1899, and it tells the story of a married woman, Edna, who is spending the summer with her children at a resort while her husband is back in the city working. And she falls in love with a young unmarried man, and she is the pursuer. So that's one of the things that makes this story so radical, not just for its time, but to some extent even today. So when you'll read it, you'll find that there are some 19th century old-fashioned elements to it, but in some ways it reads like a very contemporary novel. Although The Awakening is a really famous novel, Chopin herself was actually known for her short, snappy short stories, many of them with a very melodramatic plot line. They read almost like first drafts, which a lot of them actually were. Chopin wasn't really big on deep revising. She would snap out a story and there it was. And so you can read a lot of her stories in a collection today. Probably the most famous one is called The Story of an Hour. It's a very dramatic story about a woman, the hour in which a woman first learns that her husband has supposedly been killed in a terrible accident, and takes her through the grieving process to the point at which she thinks, I'm free now. And so Chopin is very interested in the restrictions of marriage on women and the possibility that a woman might break free of those restrictions. Chopin herself was widowed at a fairly young age, left to raise her young children herself. She is a Louisiana writer, a Southern writer, and so this novel, The Awakening, takes place in Louisiana. And as you can guess, she is known for her female characters. Many of her stories take place from a female perspective, and a lot of them are psychological stories that kind of get inside the heads of these women who are thinking things that at the time in the late 19th century were not really appropriate to say out loud. One of the nice things about The Awakening is that Chopin takes a little bit more time and care to develop not only Edna's character, but the character of a number of different women in the novel. And so one tip I have for you in reading The Awakening is to pay attention to the different female figures in the story. They're to some extent representative, symbolic of different roles that women play, but they're also quite interesting in their own regard. That's probably something that you might not think about doing if you aren't familiar with the novel, but something that's worth paying attention to as you read. Other than that, The Awakening is not a difficult read. It's a short novel. This copy that I have is actually half critical essays, so it's only about half as long as this particular copy. It's a pretty quick read, so there's not a whole lot of help that I think you're going to need in order to read this. The only other thing that might be a little bit challenging is that there is some French vocabulary sprinkled in, because again, this is taking place in Louisiana, so there's a Cajun culture there that is drawing upon the French colonial influence. You might want to have a French dictionary handy so you can look up some of the French phrases that are sprinkled throughout the story. The Awakening is a great choice for a book club read, especially in a month when your book club maybe doesn't want to take on a 300-page novel, but you want to read something that's a classic, that's worth talking about, that gives you some rich information and rich ideas to dig into together. Talking about taboos in society at that time and how many of them carry over to today, talking about the emotional depth of the women in this novel, talking about what you think Kate Chopin was up to. There's a lot to dig into, and if you get a critical edition like this one, of course you could also dig into some of the critical readings about the novel and see what you think about them, or read some of the book reviews that came out at the time and think about what the context was for this interesting feminist text, The Awakening by Kate Chopin. If you like what you see here, please remember to subscribe, and I'll be back soon with another episode of Better Book Clubs.